At the end of this lecture, you should be very familiar with nonlinear dialogues and you should be able to answer this question. How do nonlinear dialogues branch to the next intent? Unlike linear dialogues, nonlinear dialogues absolutely require more than one intent to implement. Every intent that makes up this nonlinear dialogue is responsible for extracting some information from the user, but the nonlinear dialogue branches to the next intent based on what the response from the user was. So the response from the previous intent determines the next intent that's going to be triggered in this nonlinear dialogue. If you are running a website or have a web application which allows a user to plan trips, then you're also going to include a customer satisfaction tool within your app or site. Let's see how we can implement this using a non-linear dialogue in Dialogflow. We'll make our customer satisfaction survey very specific. We only want information on the hotel where the customer happened to stay during her trip. Now, also, the kind of feedback that we want about this hotel is very, very specific. The first thing we want to know is about how the customer liked the location of the hotel. Now, there are, of course, a variety of responses to this particular question, but we'll consider just two for simplicity's sake. The customer might say, I love the location, it was great, or that the location was terrible. There are, of course, more nuanced responses that you could consider, but we'll keep things simple and stick to good and bad. Once we have information on what the user thought about the location of the hotel, we'll move on to our next question, where we are now interested in knowing what the user thought about the facilities at the hotel. Did she like the facilities? Were they good or bad? Again, we'll stick with these granular categorizations and ignore the possibility of more nuanced replies. One possibility, which forms one path through these intents, is that the customer was very happy with the facilities at the hotel as well as the location. The customer says the location was very good and follows up with the facilities were great. Another possibility is that the customer was happy with the location but unhappy with the facilities in the hotel. Notice how the intents that are going to be triggered changes based on what the user responded with. Location was good, facilities were bad. Then we walk through a different series of intents. If the user says location was terrible but the facilities were good, then there are a different series of intents that are invoked. All these combinations are possible. So there are four different paths that are possible through these intents, and our dialogue will follow one of these branches based on what the user responds with. In order for this branching to work correctly, there needs to be information passed between intents, and we'll do this with the help of context. So, the information from the first intent, which asks about feedback on the location of the hotel, will pass the location feedback context to the next intent. The next intent that will be triggered will be one of these two. The first intent will be triggered if the customer was happy with the location. The second intent will be triggered if the customer was unhappy with the location. In both cases, they get the same input context, that is location feedback. These intents will then follow up with questions about how the customer liked the facilities at her hotel. The user can rate the facilities as good or bad, and the rating that the user gives these facilities is passed on to the next set of intents in the facilities feedback context. Note that in order to implement this non-linear dialogue for our customer satisfaction survey, we need to create a total of 5 intents. The intent which kickstarts the process, that's the one on the very left, which asks for feedback on the location of the hotel. Then the intent that we move to if the location is good or bad, and the two intents that we move to if the facilities are good or bad. Now, in order to set up this nonlinear dialogue, we need to capture the user's rating for the location as well as the facilities of the hotel. For this, we need to set up a brand new entity, which is why we start in the entities section of our dialog flow screen. So click on entities and let's go ahead and create a brand new entity representing a user's rating of location or facilities. Now, because we want to keep this very simple, we are not going to define any synonyms. So go ahead and uncheck the define synonyms checkbox. The only two possible values for ratings that we're going to accept is good or bad. So the user can say the location was good or the location was bad. The facilities were good or bad. There are no nuanced, it was okay, it was so so, I hated it, or terrible. We now have a lot of work to do on entities, so let's go ahead and get started. There are 5 different entities that we have to create to take into account the branching scenarios for our customer satisfaction survey. So we will kickstart the first entity, that is the support entity. You can think of this entity as the entry point into our customer satisfaction survey. This kickstarts the process. And the way a customer can kickstart this process is by asking for support, asking to provide feedback, saying that she has complaints, and so on. So specify your user expressions accordingly. The customer can simply say support and get this entity invoked, can say feedback. We'll keep it terse for simplicity's sake. Since this is the first intent invoked in our nonlinear dialogue, there will be no input context to this particular intent. This intent should be invoked directly as soon as the customer asks for support or wants to give feedback. So, no input context, we just have a single output context, that is the location feedback context. The purpose of this very first intent is to collect the user's rating on the location of the hotel. Now, the rating can be good or bad, and this rating information is connected via the location feedback context to the intents which come after this, which is why the output context is set to location feedback. Set the expiry of this feedback context to 3 requests from the user. We don't want it to live very long. And let's configure our text response. The text response for this intent should be designed to invoke a rating from the user, either good or bad. And this rating is for the location. That's the information we want to collect first. So we'd say something like, how would you rate the location of the hotel? Good or bad? The user's response to this particular query can be one of two. The location was good or the location was bad. We are going to go ahead and create 2 new intents to deal with each of these situations. If the user says location was good, then we'll branch to the location good intent. If the user says the location was bad, we'll branch to the location bad intent. We start off by creating the location good intent. Remember, we invoke this intent when the user responds the location was good or good to the query posed by the last intent. How was the location of the hotel that you stayed at? Now, what are the contexts that we'll configure for this intent? Now, this intent flows through from the previous intent, which means the input context should be set to the output context of the previous intent that we created, which is the location feedback context. Now, from this location good intent, we are going to move on to a facilities intent, which means the output context of this location good intent will not be location feedback. Instead, we'll create a brand new context and call it facilities feedback. This facilities feedback is the context that connects the location intents with the facilities intents. All right, once we've set up the input and output context, we are ready to set up the user expressions that will trigger the location good intent. Now, only if the user rating for the location has been good will this intent be triggered. So the word good or the phrase the location was good will trigger this particular intent. Notice how we use the rating entity in our user expression to trigger the location good intent. Now, in the parameters table, just mark this rating as a required parameter because without the rating, this intent can never be triggered. If you want to make your customer's conversation with your bot more natural, then you might choose to define prompts in order to extract this rating. I've left that part aside for now because I'm more focused on the non-linear dialogue. Now, in the text response, you'll need to accomplish 2 things. The first is you need to acknowledge that you're happy that the user liked the hotel that she stayed at. And secondly, you need to extract the rating for the facilities so that you can branch to one of the 2 facilities intents. So glad to hear that. How would you rate the facilities at the hotel? Good or bad is an example of a text response that you can use. You can configure multiple responses along these lines if you want to. Now that we've set up an intent, when the user thought the location was good, let's set up a corresponding intent for when the user responds with the location was bad or I hated the location. This is another branch of our customer satisfaction survey. We'll create this new intent called location bad. The input context to this intent is the same as the input context to the previous location intent, which is location dash feedback. The output context will be facilities feedback. So delete the location feedback as the output context, which was added in automatically, and set up facilities feedback as the correct output context. This intent is an exact parallel of the location good intent that we configured previously. The user says section is what will differ. That is because this intent will be triggered when the user says that she did not like the location of the hotel that she stayed at. So, a rating such as bad or it was bad will trigger or invoke this particular intent. Once again, make this a required parameter. We do require a rating from the user before we move ahead, and then enter the text response. The text response should acknowledge that you have heard that the user did not like the location of the hotel. So you should have some sympathetic response, such as, sorry to hear that. In addition, you also want to move along with the customer satisfaction survey. So you'll go ahead and ask the next question. How are the facilities at the hotel? Good or bad? So make sure you include both in whatever responses you configure. So, how do nonlinear dialogues branch to the next intent? There are two parts to the answer. One is the input context of the next intent, which we can branch to, should be set to the output context of the previous intent. And then you have a rating or some entity that you specify. And based on what the user rating is, you choose to invoke one intent or the other. You determine which intent you want to invoke by configuring the user expression of each of the intents appropriately. Certain intents will be invoked with the user expression of good, certain intents will be invoked with the user expression of bad in our example.